Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Civil War in a Global Context, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to take just a few minutes to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, and we are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Let me try to explain what that means. First of all, we're an independent institution. That means we're a private nonprofit outfit. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we run here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics in history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, subjects like that. Since we opened in 1978, about 1,300 scholars have done work here, and they have published about 1,300 books as the result of their research at the center. The place may seem like an ivory tower, and from these pictures it actually looks like an ivory tower, but it's really not. The founders wanted it to connect with a wide variety of people, and we do that in a number of ways, and we were particularly interested in connecting with teachers, and we do that in several ways as well. You can find out just what we offer for teachers by going to americainclass.org. That will land you at this page, and from there you can have access to all of the programs and resources that we offer the teachers. Now, when our program is over tonight, I see we're getting some problems with sound. Okay. All right, sound is fine. Okay, my colleague Karen Koplik, who usually is my troubleshooter, she doesn't have sound, so she'll be back in, and I hope then she'll be able to help folks who are having some problems with sound. In the meantime, those of you who can hear me, let me tell you that after the seminar, you can go to the Civil War in Global Context website, and there you will find a copy of the PowerPoint plus a recording of the seminar, and we invite you to use material from the seminar in your classes. That's what it's there for, so feel free to plunder the PowerPoint. On this website, you will also find an evaluation, and if you'll click on that and fill that out for us and submit it to us, we'll really appreciate that. We do pay attention to what you tell us on the evaluations, and we try to improve our programs on the basis of what we find there. Once we receive your evaluation, we will send you a letter that you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation in the whatever credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Okay, we have two sets of goals actually for our seminars. One, we've associated with the Common Core. Many of you teach in states that have adopted the Common Core, and part of our seminar, one of the purposes of our seminars, is to help you position primary documents for use in Common Core teaching through close reading, because as you know, Common Core seeks to help ensure that all students are college and career ready in literacy, and it seeks to do that through promoting close and attentive reading, and we hope that our seminars will help you in that task. Now, how will the seminar work? Well, Professor Doyle is going to be lecturing. His lecture will be key to a presentation of some slides. The slides will have text on them, some images tonight. We'll stop to analyze some material. There'll be some discussion questions when we get to some of the text. We'll pose those to you, and we hope you'll respond by putting your cursor in the green box that I've bracketed there. Type your response and click send, and then we will bring that into the program at appropriate moments. I'll be paying attention to the chat. If you have questions or comments you'd like to chat in, please do that. Again, I'll be paying attention to the chat, and I'll bring those comments and questions in at appropriate moments. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get underway. I said we have some goals. I mentioned our first goal there to align teaching with the Common Core, but here we have an intellectual goal, the understanding, the takeaway we hope that you will take back from the seminar this evening to your teaching. Let me just put that on the table. During the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy had distinct foreign policy goals, which each side saw as critical to its success. Each side presented a case to the world. In an effort to obtain recognition and support, chiefly from Britain and France, the South portrayed the war as a conflict with broad international implications. To prevent foreign recognition and support for the South, the North sought to define the conflict narrowly as a rebellion within a nation. So keep that understanding in mind. That will inform everything we talk about tonight. Now, you had lots of good questions on the seminar forum. Let's get those out. What was the global reputation of the United States on the eve of the war? How did other nations view the American Civil War? How important was foreign policy to conduct of the war? Did Lincoln have any foreign policy goals in mind when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation? Could the South have successfully seceded if it had won foreign recognition and support? Why did England not support the Confederacy? And finally, if the South had looked more like a winner, would it obtain the international support it sought? To help us thread our way through these questions, we're very pleased to have with us tonight Don Doyle, the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. Last year, Don was a fellow here at the Humanities Center, and he was working on a book on this very topic, the Civil War in a Global Context. He's done a great deal of research on the American South. You see some of his titles right there. So at this moment, let me turn the program over to Don. Let me find his name here. Okay. All right, Don. Tell us about, please, the American Civil War in global context. It's all yours.
Thank you, Richard, for that very nice introduction, and welcome all of you to this seminar on the American Civil War and its global perspectives. As Richard said, I've been immersed in researching and writing a book, and in that picture that he showed of the atrium of the National Humanities Center, I can remember my office was just off to the right of the screen. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight comes out of that research and comes out of the story of the Civil War as foreigners interpreted it and viewed it as something that was much bigger than just a civil war.
Okay, Don, if I may just interrupt
Yeah.
here for a moment. If you could speak a bit more loudly,
Okay.
people are having a hard time hearing you. So if you could just speak up a bit. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to convey is the idea that this other war, this diplomatic struggle abroad, was every bit as important as the war of bullets and blood. I call it the war of ink and ideas overseas, the effort to try to win public favor in the major powers of Europe, but also in Latin America, and the effort of the South to gain recognition and the North to block that from happening. I want to just briefly discuss the importance of international recognition because it sounds like something that's just a kind of diplomatic courtesy. But it's much more important than that. To recognize a new nation that is claiming independence from another is to say, you are a sovereign nation. We can do business with you. They can, a recognized nation can make treaties, can take on loans, and can do business with the world. It's also now protected by international law. And while there was not a UN or another institution to enforce international law, it really mattered that you were recognized or not. And so that was an important thing. And recognition would come, as it always does. About half of the world's nations today began as breakaway states, breakaway nations, secession, separatist movements, just like the United States. And then in more recent times, in the 1860s, the United Kingdom of Italy, they were breaking away from foreign powers and creating a new nation, and they would go before the nations of the world and ask for recognition. And the Confederacy thought that it was going to be following along the line of new nations that had come on the stage since the beginnings of the American Revolution and all of the revolutions that had occurred in Europe, in Latin America, and other parts of the world at this time. Let's look first at the case that the Confederacy was trying to make, remember that all of the secessions of the Deep South take place before Lincoln has even taken power. And in fact, what they are striving to do is to set up not just independent states that have broken away from the Union, from the United States of America. They have formed in early February a new nation that calls itself the Confederate States of America. They have a constitution, they have a government, it's been appointed provisionally, but they've got elections set up. They are trying to demonstrate, not just to their own people, and not only to the North, but to the world at large, that we are a nation. We have a government, we have an army, we have flags, we are going to defend ourselves. And so the first real statement, official statement to the world, comes in Jefferson Davis's inaugural address on February 18th, 1861. Now keep in mind, Lincoln would not be inaugurated until March 4th, 1861. So all of this is taking place before the Union government has been handed over to the Republicans.
Don, for some reason we're losing you're fading out again, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to really belt it out. I don't know what the problem is tonight, but your voice was fading out. Is the microphone close to your mouth?
I'll put it even closer. Is that better?
That sounds better. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
So let's read Jefferson Davis's inaugural address given in Montgomery, Alabama on a kind of cold but sunny February day. Our present political position has been achieved in a manner unprecedented in the history of nations. It illustrates the American idea that governments rest on the consent of the governed, and that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them at will whenever they become destructive of the ends for which they were established. So this is taken right out of the Declaration of Independence, and essentially he's kind of throwing this language and logic of revolution back on the United States. The declared purpose of the Compact of the Union from which we have withdrawn was to, quote, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. And then he goes on to explain that when those purposes have been perverted from the purposes for which it was ordained and ceased to answer the ends for which it was established, a peaceful appeal to the ballot box declared that so far as they are concerned, the government created by that compact should cease to exist. In this, they merely assert the right which the Declaration of Independence of July 4, 1776 defined to be inalienable. Of the time, occasion of its exercise, they as sovereigns or the final judges, each for itself, the impartial and enlightened verdict of mankind will vindicate the rectitude of our conduct, and he who knows the hearts of men will judge the sincerity of which we have labored to preserve the government of our fathers in this
Don, I really apologize for interrupting you so much, but the sound is fading again. I don't know what the problem is. Your voice just faded away. Let's try it again. I think everybody got the that passage you read. Let's just go on, see if you could speak up. I really do apologize for this, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, Don.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the next step was to send emissaries out into the world. And of course, they had one commission that was sent up to the most important foreign country that the Confederacy was concerned with, and that was the United States. And of course, that was to be a negotiation and a kind of amicable divorce. That went nowhere. And almost immediately, they sent out 3 foreign commissioners to Europe. And with this, the Secretary of State, Robert Toombs, gave instructions to them. These were William Yancey, Pierre Rost, and a man by the name of Ambrose Dudley Man. And they set sail in March for Europe. And what he's explaining, this is a lengthy set of instructions about what they are to present as an argument to Europe. And what Toombs is saying is that it will not be necessary to enter into a detailed statement of the reasons which impelled the people of the Confederate States to dissolve their union with the United States. But it may be well to allude to some of the more prominent of the causes which produced that result in order to show that the step was not taken hastily or passionately, but after long, patient, and mature deliberation, when the people became convinced that their honor, social and material welfare demanded separation as the best means by which these vital interests could be preserved. So here he's saying, let's not talk about slavery. Let's just say that we have entered in this movement for independence with a well-considered and long-considered judgment. This is not an impulsive revolutionary movement in the heat of the moment. And then he says, you can point with force to the efforts which have been persistently made by the manufacturing states of the North to compel the agricultural interests of the South, out of the proceeds of their industry, to pay bounties to Northern manufacturers in the shape of high protective duties on foreign imports. This actually alluded to a new tariff that was passed in the North, and the tariff really became a very appealing point for the South to put forward because, of course, England, but also France and other European countries wanted free trade with Southern cotton and didn't like the tariff at all. And it was a way of making the case for nationhood and independence something other than slavery and the perpetuation of slavery. So this was a really adroit diplomatic move, and it's one that was tied to the Confederate idea that sooner or later, the European countries, whether or not they liked slavery or approved of its perpetuation, they would come to terms with the South. They would, as they put it, bow before King Cotton. So this is kind of the case that the Confederacy makes to the world, that we have chosen to leave the United States. This is a legal and peaceful secession. It's not a revolution. It's not an attempt to overthrow the government of the North. We just want to be left alone to till our soil, raise our cotton, and trade it without any tariffs to Europe.
Don, a number of participants have noted, as you pointed out, the echoes of the Declaration of Independence in Jefferson Davis's inaugural address. Would it be fair to say that the South was trying to appropriate for itself the real mantle of the Revolution and the Founding Fathers?
Yes, that is exactly what they were trying to do, and often they would talk about how we are the legatees of the true America in carrying out the wish of the Founding Fathers, and that the North had been corrupted and taken over by hordes of immigrants, and that it had strayed from the true path of the American founders.
And this economic argument that Toombs is making here, how compelling would that be to other nations of the world?
It had broad appeal, and a lot of people think this was aimed just at the British with their large cotton textile industry in Lancashire and the north of England. But France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the German states also had a deep interest in cotton. Even northern Italy had a cotton industry, and the overwhelming majority of the world's cotton was at this time coming out of the American South. And so even though the Confederacy recognized that there might be some moral qualms with human slavery, they believed that economic interests would overcome that. And it wasn't just economic and business interests. It was the fear that a cotton famine would ignite social revolution among the working class of Europe. So there's also a social and political connection to King Cotton diplomacy.
And a number of participants have noted here that this economic argument ultimately relies on slavery. So wasn't the South at all afraid that people would see through this economic argument? As you said, they felt that, I guess they felt that the other countries in the world would just sort of look beyond slavery because the economics were so important to them.
Yes, and remember that, at the end of the story, slavery became an obstacle, and the Union transformed this war to preserve the Union into a war of emancipation. But at the time, there was no reason to believe that slavery would disqualify the Confederacy from entry into the world of nations. After all, the United States was recognized, and it had slavery right up to this time. It still had slavery, even as the 7 states had seceded. And many nations of the world, including those in Latin America, continued to have slavery as they won independence and won recognition. Even France, which had ended slavery at the end of 1848, was recognized as a nation still with slavery. And of course, Britain itself, just as late as 1833, when it abolished slavery, was an empire that was devoted to, or that at least protected and sanctioned slavery, and was very active in the slave trade. So there were not many clean hands in this, and I think the Confederacy was surprised, and had reason to be surprised, that the world would have such antipathy toward the institution that they had, after all, for decades.
Okay. I think the sound was fading a little bit. Did everybody hear what Don said? We've got some technical difficulties tonight. His voice fades in and out. Okay, I guess everybody did hear that. We have a good question here. Would quick recognition have made a critical difference in the outcome? That's very similar to one of our forum questions. So, Don, would quick recognition have made a critical difference in the outcome of the war?
Yes, if one of the great powers of Europe, Britain or France, had recognized the South, it would have been a demoralizing blow to the North on its civilian population, on its effort to mobilize the civilian population in the army. It would have been followed by others. France had agreed to act in concert with Britain. There was it would have been a major blow. And of course, immediately in the war in November of 1861, it almost came to blows between Britain and the United States with the Trent affair. And you remember that the Union Navy had apprehended a British ship and had removed 2 Confederate envoys, John Slidell and James Mason. And that was a violation of British neutrality on the high seas, and it nearly came to blows. And with that, it would have created a world war, and it probably would have at least improved the chances of Confederate victory.
Okay, so again, you were fading out. So what you were saying, though, that if the South had won recognition early on, it might have precipitated a world war and could have brought about a Southern victory. Okay, we have another question here. Did Lincoln fully grasp how devastating that international recognition would have been, and thus have more reason to issue the Emancipation Proclamation? And that does relate directly to one of our forum questions. Did Lincoln have any foreign policy goals in mind when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation? So, Don, how would you respond to that?
Yes, Lincoln worked very closely with his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, and Seward was fearful of the Emancipation Proclamation. He thought that the European powers would see this as an invitation to servile insurrection, as he called it, and that it would look like a kind of barbaric appeal to a slave uprising in the South. and further that the emancipation of the slaves, the sudden emancipation of 4 million slaves, would disturb the cotton markets for decades, and that would really upset Britain, and that it would, instead of leading to support internationally, that it would actually lead to Europe coming in on behalf of the South. Lincoln, on the other hand, I think understood that while the governments of Britain and France and Spain and other European powers, they didn't care as much about slavery, and they wanted to recognize the South if it meant free trade with cotton, that an Emancipation Proclamation would have tremendous appeal with what he imagined to be a more liberal public, the working class, the middle class, that abhorred slavery, and that once they saw that this was a war between the anti-slavery party and the slaveocracy, that they could never support the South. And in the end, Lincoln, who was an unworldly provincial, really, I think, understood world opinion instinctively better than some people.
Okay, Don, I'm afraid we lost your sound again. This is really unusual. I'm sorry about that. Could you repeat the part about Lincoln and his unworldliness, please?
Well, Lincoln was a provincial. He had never been outside of the United States. He didn't really read foreign papers. And Seward was the kind of the man of the world who had traveled in Europe and who had met all the heads of state. But Lincoln seemed to have an instinctive understanding that the public overseas, the middle class, and also the working class would stand by the Union if they knew that the Union was the anti-slavery party, and if they knew that this war was not just to establish territorial sovereignty and to conquer the South, but that this war was a war of emancipation. They would stand by it, Lincoln thought. And he was right.
Okay.
Now you're breaking up, Richard.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I do apologize for this. This has not happened before. This is a new twist here on our use of WebEx. But we do have another question here. So Lincoln's one war at a time was an understatement in that Lincoln was also motivated by not wanting the British to enter with the South. So that was one of his main motivations in signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Early on, he had been told by foreign diplomats, including Karl Schurz, the German revolutionary that is discussed in one of the slides here, that once we make this a war of emancipation, no European power will support the South. So he had been educated, Lincoln had, and had, I think, as I say, a more instinctive rather than two-third understanding of world opinion.
Okay, well, we've got about an hour. Shall we move on then?
Let's go. Now, the next slide, 19, turns to Lincoln's inaugural address. And here is Lincoln now. In his first public statement since being elected, or first major statement on policy, and he is trying to tell the nation, but also the world, here is what we stand for, here is my policy. And it's a statement that seems to guarantee slavery. It seems to assure the South that they have nothing to worry about. And that's exactly what he's trying to do. He's saying that apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states, that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property, meaning slaves, and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. And there's no cause for this. And then in these few lines at the end, he really kind of gives away the store, the whole moral advantage of the anti-slavery party when he says, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." And he says, "I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." And with that, even liberals overseas thought, so what is this about? Is it just about boundaries and territory and tariffs? If that's all they're fighting for, if this is just a civil war, then what interest do we have in this? Now, what Lincoln was trying to do here was to show that this was a rebellion without cause. That what he was doing was simply to show that there's no reason for the South to fear a Lincoln administration. But in the process, he really takes slavery off the table. And that would be a problem that would kind of loom over Union policy throughout the war. And that's what he had to circumvent with his Emancipation Proclamation about a year and a half later.
Okay, so we have a question. We have some comments here. Let's see. One participant writes, "This is why we needed a war, so that Lincoln had the right to interfere with the institution of slavery." So was Lincoln in some way, did he want this war to happen?
No, I don't believe he did. Lincoln was a moderate on slavery. He believed it was wrong, morally wrong. He said that if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But he was also conservative in the sense that he did not believe the president had the power under the Constitution to interfere with the right of states to protect slavery. And I think that he really believed that all of this was the result of a radical fringe within the South that was leading the South to destroy the Union. And he wanted, above all, to preserve that Union, with or without slavery. And he really wanted to preserve the Union. Circumstances forced him to emancipate the slaves, and an ingenious kind of circumvention of the Constitution by adopting the idea that this would be an act of war, a war measure rather than a constitutional act, that he was emancipating the slaves as a military necessity. That allowed him to do what had to be done, in his view, as he faced the dire circumstances of the Union in the summer of 1862. But all that was ahead. At this point, I think he would have done anything to persuade the South to stay in the Union, including guarantees of slavery that would have continued slavery for one or two more generations.
There's another question here about the evolution of Lincoln's views on slavery. Do you think his views evolved, what you might say, in a moral sense, or did his views evolve more for political expediency?
I think his moral views on slavery were absolutely steady. I think he hated the institution. I think that he said at one point, it was in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, said, "I hate slavery, and I hate it because of what it does to the slaves themselves. But," and this I think was equally or even a greater reason for him, "I hate it because it embarrasses us in the world. It mocks our claims to be a democracy and to be a bastion of human liberty." And so even then, in 1858, this prairie lawyer had an idea that slavery was wrong because of the injustice that it did to the slaves, but it was also something that violated basic American principles and mocked the claims of America as a beacon of liberty to the world. So this carries on. into the war. And I don't think that he evolves in his view of slavery. There is, I think, another evolution, and that has to do with his view of black people, of slaves and future freedmen, and whether or not they had the capacity to be members of the nation. And there, I think that Lincoln was had serious doubts about the racial capacity of blacks early on. He wondered if they could fight, for example, or whether or not they would simply surrender and lay down their arms if they were enlisted in the Union Army. And when he saw proof that African Americans were very willing to take up arms to fight, and that they fought with terrific courage, he really defended them. And at one point in Illinois, he said, some of you Union soldiers, you white soldiers, are not willing to fight for the slaves' freedom. They are willing, he said, to fight for yours. And I think that showed a kind of new attitude about the capacity of blacks as soldiers and also as members of the nation. Now, that said, Lincoln maintained a view that the blacks, once they were freed, would be better off for themselves, and that whites in America would be better off if the two races were separated. And that led to discussions about colonization. Some of that was for political purposes, to try to assuage the more racist views in the North, but some of that came out of his own very deep racial doubts. And in that sense, Lincoln was a man who evolved in many ways, but on that he was still he still was conflicted by doubts about the full capacity of blacks to be citizens, but never in doubt about their right to enjoy the basic freedoms of the right to life and to liberty and to some kind of basic civil rights.
That's an important distinction to make. The way his views on slavery were constant, but he evolved in his views toward African Americans. We have another question here. Didn't the Confiscation Acts to some degree serve as a catalyst for the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime measure? And then when you respond to that, you might want to remind us what the Confiscation Acts were.
Well, early on in the war, in May 1861, slaves were running away, and they were declared by Benjamin Butler, the famous general from New England, to be contraband of war, and that they were not given their freedom, they were not emancipated, but because they were property of rebels, they were declared contraband. So it's like property that's confiscated from the enemy. And that was the thin edge of the wedge that led to more and more contraband slaves, as they were called, coming to the Union lines. And in that, there developed the idea that if you would weaken the South by encouraging the slaves to at least run away. And of course, Frederick Douglass was calling on the Union to encourage the slaves to emancipate themselves and to liberate, he said, to strike the hand that holds the hoe and to take away the labor force of the South. And in that, it would help to collapse the rebellion from within. So there were all kinds of strategies, as well as military strategies, diplomatic strategies, and other very pragmatic measures that were involved in the move toward emancipation. So it was not just a kind of moral awakening or evolution, but part of the strategy of fighting a war against an enemy that depended on its slaves.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Yes, let's go to the next slide. Now, here is Seward again, early in the war, just after it's broken out, giving instructions to his emissaries overseas. And this is to William Dayton in France, but he sent a very similar one to Charles Francis Adams in Britain. And essentially what he's saying is that the Union is not going to upset slavery. The territories will remain in all respects the same, whether the revolution shall succeed or fail. The condition of slavery in the several states will remain just the same, whether it succeed or fail. So this is not an attack on slavery. Do not worry about cotton production or social revolution within the United States. We are here, we are fighting to restore the Union as it was and not to engage in social revolution. So this too was a very conservative, limited message to the world early on. So when you look at it, both sides are saying, this is not about slavery. This is just about the South saying self-determination and ending a voluntary compact of nations, and the Union saying this is just about restoring the Union and putting down what is a domestic insurrection by a small group of traitors who are leading the South into rebellion.
Okay, shall we move ahead then?
Okay, now the next episode here has to do with an unusual story that most of you probably had not heard, but everyone was aware of it in the summer of 1861, and that was the invitation that the Union High Command made to the Italian hero Giuseppe Garibaldi. And Garibaldi had just unified Italy by invading the South, ironically, and sweeping across Sicily and marching into Naples and declaring the Italian Mezzogiorno, as they called it, part of the new United Kingdom of Italy. And exactly as the United States was falling apart in March 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was declared and was recognized by the United States. Garibaldi wanted to attack Rome and wanted to complete the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, and he was at liberty to take offers from the United States. And of course, what he was trying to do on his end was to put pressure on King Victor Emmanuel and the Prime Minister Cavour to complete the revolution. But he was also very interested in the United States and its struggle for liberty, as he saw it, and to defend Republican institutions. And as some of you may know, he lived briefly in the United States. He was in exile in the 1850s on Staten Island, and he regarded himself incorrectly, but he regarded himself as a citizen of the United States and was willing to offer his sword to fight for liberty. Now, this diplomat by the name of Henry Sanford, who was a career diplomat and someone, again, that you may never have heard of, he was had been in the diplomatic service since being a young man, and he was the U.S. minister to Belgium, but unofficially, he was head of what they called Secret Service operations in Europe. And Seward, with Lincoln's permission, instructed him to go to this tiny island in the Mediterranean and make an offer to the hero of two worlds, Giuseppe Garibaldi, to take a position as Major General in the Union Army. And Sanford goes by train, by ship, by rowboat over to this island and gets there late in the day and meets this Italian hero. And in French or Italian, I'm not sure which language they used, Garibaldi did not speak English, they negotiated this offer. And essentially what Garibaldi said was that I will come under two conditions. One of them is that I want total command of all armed forces. I would be worthless as a second in command. A captain must be in charge of his ship, he said. And second, I want this to be a war for the abolition of slavery. He said, Sanford wrote back to Seward, this is a dispatch from Belgium, he said, he would be of little use, he said, without the first. And without the second, the war would appear to be like any civil war in which the world at large could have little interest or sympathy. Now, this was probably no news to Seward and Lincoln, but it was really, it became an international story that embarrassed the Union. It looked like the Union was going overseas to get generals when the ones at home were unable to fight or unable to win the war. This was, of course, after the First Battle of Bull Run, a very embarrassing defeat for the Union. But it also exposed the question that everyone was asking. What are you fighting for? What is this war about? And at that point, Sanford could only say, well, we hope that slavery will end, but at present we are fighting only to preserve the Union. Okay. Now, are we ready to go on to the next episode?
Yes, I think so. Any questions about Garibaldi? Let me see if I can summarize it. Lincoln, was it Lincoln, did you say, who asked Garibaldi to
yeah, Seward instructs, but it's with Lincoln's approval.
Huh.
And exactly what transpired between Lincoln and Seward that day, I don't know. But apparently the decision was made immediately after the Battle of Bull Run. And Seward gave a very robust instruction to Seward to invite this soldier of freedom to come and fight for the liberty and freedom of America. And so it was. And as I said, everyone was talking about it at the time, and no one remembers it now.
Right. So this was a serious offer.
It was a serious offer. It wasn't just a kind of diplomatic faux pas. It was something that the Union thought, you know, the idea of bringing an aging and rheumatoid arthritis-stricken Italian to America to lead the Union Army, it might not seem like the wisest military idea, but he had such terrific moral power in the world that it would have been a great kind of public diplomacy stunt, if you will. And it really would have galvanized public opinion on the side of the Union among the liberal public in Europe. Now, it would have really upset conservatives in Spain, in France. Catholics did not like Garibaldi. He was the enemy of the Pope. And so it would have polarized a lot of people in Europe. But I think Seward knew what he was doing, and Lincoln knew too, even though he may not have known a whole lot about Garibaldi.
I think you've answered this question that was posed here. The question I have is why did Lincoln have no confidence in the capabilities of his military leaders? So the answer to the question why is because it would have been a great international diplomatic coup to get this liberal freedom fighter on the side of the Union, and that would have galvanized liberal opinion in Europe. But what about that the second part of the participant's question? Did Lincoln have no confidence in the capability of his military leaders?
After Bull Run, I think that he realized that the Army was not ready to fight. His confidence would continue to go down, and there was a real problem there with Union generals. I think the other side of that is that the news that the Union was going abroad to hire this aging Italian hero was thought to be very demoralizing and humiliating for Union officers. But I think this was done more for public diplomacy than it was for military strategy. Now, you may not know, but there were also French princes, the Orleans princes, that were over fighting in the Union Army, and they were there primarily as a kind of symbolic gesture. But it really excited a lot of of their admirers in France in particular, and enemies of Napoleon III. So there were a lot of games, kind of diplomatic games and public relations games that were being played here. And this was a serious offer, and I think that the value was more diplomatic than military in having Garibaldi there.
Did the South do any similar things?
Well, they did not have as much success with that. They also had regiments. So there was one in Louisiana that was named the Garibaldi Guards, and they quickly changed their name after this episode. But many of them, many of the Confederate soldiers were foreign-born, Irish in particular, and so that they just had fewer foreign-born. And in the end, the Confederacy was not trying to make a liberal appeal to liberal Europe, and the Union was kind of fumbling toward that appeal at this time.
But the South did not go abroad to seek military leadership the way the North did.
No, not that I know of in any particular case. There were rumors that they were going abroad to enlist Napoleon's nephew and to try to get foreign princes to come over. And there was even talk that they wanted to repatriate the South with the British Empire. So some of this was rumors and publicity, but that idea that the South was monarchist and wanted to either bring a foreign prince over or to join up with one of the European empires, those were rife in the early part of the war and at the very end of the war, too.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that Lincoln was disappointed in the performance of his generals at the First Battle of Bull Run. Did he, to what extent did he anticipate that they would have done a better job?
I don't know that Lincoln knew enough about Garibaldi, but he had a, is that what you're talking about, that a foreigner might do a better job, or that the generals, the Union generals, might improve?
Well, we had a question here. Had Lincoln been convinced that the first major battle would strongly demonstrate strength for the Union? So I guess the question there is, did he expect his generals to do better in that first major battle?
Oh yes, I think that the Battle of Bull Run was a huge surprise and a frightening one. You had green Union troops out there who were cutting and running, some of them whose 90-day commissions had been up and they decided to go home and in the middle of the battle, and some of them were just scared and just it was a disorderly retreat and a very embarrassing one, and it might easily have led to the invasion of Washington, D.C. and a truly humiliating setback for the Union cause.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Now, this slide, number 23, goes to a meeting that takes place between this German immigrant by the name of Karl Schurz, who is appointed minister to Spain. And he goes over to Spain and begins to realize in September, and this too is about the same time that the offer to Garibaldi was made, that the Union is going to lose this war before it even begins, and that it must make this into a war against slavery. He writes a lengthy dispatch to Seward and tells him that the governments of Europe would just as soon see the United States fall apart, that they don't like democracy, they hate America because it's an example to Republicans and Democrats in Europe, and these are aristocrats that are governing Britain, France, Spain, all of the countries of Europe, and they want democracy to fail. But he says that the European public, there is at least a liberal element among the workers and the middle class that would make it very hard for these governments to recognize the South if Lincoln makes this a war against slavery. So he resigns his ambassadorship, he makes his way home, and sometime in January 1862, this is months before the Emancipation Proclamation, he goes to meet Lincoln. And there they are in the room in the White House, and just as Schurz begins to tell him his story, Schurz doesn't know if Lincoln has read the dispatches. Seward had sent back a reply, a very icy one, that said, mind your own business. Your job is diplomacy. This is domestic policy. We're not going to emancipate the slaves. Stay in Madrid. And now Schurz is going around him and talking directly to the boss. And he pops his head in the room. And Seward says, excuse me, Seward. Excuse me for a moment. I have something to talk over with this gentleman. And Seward backs out, but you know what he must have been thinking. And then Schurz continues with this talk and goes into this lengthy and passionate explanation of his view, his understanding of Europe. So here is this international revolutionary, this cosmopolitan, talking to this former prairie lawyer. And Lincoln is listening intently. And then he waits and pauses for a minute, and he says, you may be right. Probably you are. I have been thinking so myself. I cannot imagine that any European power would dare to recognize and aid the Southern Confederacy if it becomes clear that the Confederacy stands for slavery and the Union for freedom. And so here is a glimpse at Lincoln's mind months ahead of the time that he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of the summer of 1862. But he's thinking diplomatically about this. That is, he's thinking of the Emancipation Proclamation as a diplomatic strategy. And then he explains to Schurz that while he understands how a distinct anti-slavery policy would remove the foreign danger and thus would help preserve the Union and might be necessary for the preservation of the Union, he goes on to explain in this account that it would be a problem of public opinion at home. And he wasn't sure, he puts it, whether public opinion at home was yet sufficiently prepared for it. And he wanted to keep the United States united and to keep the border states in the Union. Would not the cry, he asks, of abolition war, such as might be occasioned by a distinct anti-slavery policy, tend to disunite those forces and thus weaken the Union cause? And then he tells Schurz to look around and to come back and to tell him what he learns of his impressions of public opinion. And then at the end, in what I imagine to be a kind of wink, he refers to the dispatches that Lincoln obviously has read from Spain. And so Lincoln was kind of looking over Seward's shoulder, as it were, and aware of Schurz's message even before he came to the White House that day in January.
So Schurz is arguing that the war should be, the grounds of the war should be made slavery, and that this would sway European public opinion.
Yes.
In the Union's favor. I see. Even though Europe had no trouble recognizing America as a slaveholding nation, which you mentioned earlier. Was Lincoln? Do you think Lincoln was right in that assumption, or Schurz was right?
Yes, but not as immediately correct as we might think. And this was all this all lay ahead. But Seward was warning that emancipation might look like an invitation to social revolution, to servile insurrection. And there were those fears. And so it wasn't absolutely clear at the time which way it would come out and how Europe would react. But I think what Schurz was telling him, that you must distinguish between government policy and popular opinion. And our best game is going to be played with popular opinion. And so he was turning Lincoln to that kind of shrewd political analysis overseas.
We have a question here about Seward himself. Why would Seward, who had been, the question just disappeared from my board when I get it back here. Okay, why would Seward, who had been so strongly opposed to slavery on moral grounds before the war, not have pushed for emancipation from the beginning?
That is a good question, and I'm not sure I will ever understand William Henry Seward. Seward was a New Yorker, and remember, many argued that he lost the nomination in 1860 because he had been too radical, because he had been calling this an irrepressible conflict between two societies, and that he had referred to a higher law than the Constitution, a moral law that calls upon us to end slavery. It seems that Seward was now, as a diplomat, anticipating a much more conservative international world. I think that he was worldly, he is well-traveled, he had met all the heads of state, but I think that Seward was much more impressed by the conservative aristocratic of Europe than he was for this public opinion that Schurz was pointing to. There's something else here, and I don't know exactly how this explains it, but I think it may illuminate it to some extent. Seward was raised among slaves. His family owned slaves. Even though New York had abolished slavery, it was a gradual emancipation. And as a young man, he grew up as slaves. He watched slaves. He had slave playmates. And while he said that that made him an abolitionist, that it turned him against slavery, I think it also encouraged him toward a kind of racial prejudice in which he expected blacks to rise up in violent revolution, or at least anticipated that. And that, I think, was a sincere fear that he projected upon European public opinion. Now, this gets into a level of fear and psychology that I'm not sure we can document, but he genuinely feared emancipation as an invitation to servile insurrection. He thought it should be gradual and orderly and not an instrument of war.
Right. To what extent did the Haitian Revolution influence opinion at this time?
Well, of course, that was the dark shadow, if you will, the kind of specter that loomed over all of this. And not only Haiti, but Jamaica had a very violent transition from slavery to emancipation. And there were not many good models of nations, at least, conducting sudden emancipation without some kind of turmoil. Now, his model for a proper emancipation would have been New York and the northern states and other Latin American countries where you introduce gradual emancipation, usually through what they call the Free Womb Act. And that would be where the children of slave women would be given their freedom at age 19 or 21. It varied from one polity to another, but that was Seward's idea. And Lincoln's too, let's remember, for the way to go about an orderly emancipation.
Right. We have a, a good comment here from Char Weigel, one of our participants, reflecting on why Seward may have not pushed for emancipation. She writes, maybe also the change that occurs when you are heading a position-based party versus realizing that you are now in a position of representing a nation with diverse opinions. And she compares this to Marcy in Egypt right now. Would you say that a change in Seward's political position, he was a senator, right, and then he becomes Secretary of State, might that have influenced his thinking some?
Yes, and of course both Seward and Lincoln were very conscious that the support for emancipation, not only in the border states, but across the lower Midwest and in lots of the North, that they were willing to fight a war to preserve the Union. And even for high and lofty ideals of preserving democracy and the great republic, ideological aspirations. But when it came to racial equality or to emancipation, much of the North had to be persuaded. And there were, for example, a lot of scares about emancipated slaves coming north and taking the jobs of northern free laborers. And this was especially aggravating to Democrats and to Irish Catholics who were especially vulnerable to this idea that blacks would be taking their jobs. And so there was a lot of racial antipathy that was stirred up during the war, and particularly by the Democrats, the peace Democrats who were anti-war and pro-Southern, the Copperheads.
Right. Wasn't that part of the motivation for the draft riots in New York in 1863?
It sure was, yes. And even as the Union had won this huge victory in Gettysburg, within days there were riots breaking out against the draft, and not just against the draft, but against the use of black strikebreakers on the docks of New York. It was a race riot that led to lynchings and all kinds of violence against black people in New York. So there was a lot of tension within the North. I mean, it was not all one thing, but there were, Lincoln was aware that public opinion, as he put it, was not prepared. But I'd like to point out that that very expression suggests that Lincoln knew that public opinion was not fixed, and that even racial attitudes and the acceptance of emancipation, it was not fixed. It would evolve. And as the Union continued to fight this war, a lot of Union soldiers, for example, who would never have fought to free the slaves in 1861, were now in 1862 prepared to fight for their freedom, not just out of humanitarian concerns, but to punish the South, to end the war, and to make the South pay for, and to root out the cause of the rebellion as they saw it. It was vindictive, humanitarian. It was a whole mix of a lot of different things by this time.
And as more Northern soldiers, the war went on, and more Northern soldiers came to know former slaves as the slaves moved to Union lines. Didn't that also change the opinion of some Northern soldiers?
Yes, it did. And you see this in the letters that they write home. Chandra Manning's wonderful book, What This Cruel War Was Over, looks at soldiers' letters and diaries. And as they confront slavery, many of them are emotionally moved to become abolitionists. Others are disgusted with slavery, not because they feel compassion toward the slave, perhaps, but they just feel it's cruel and human and barbaric. And so anti-slavery opinion, again, it's not just one thing or a linear development, but it does begin to swell as the war goes forward.
Right. What was the title of that book again, Don, so we can give it to the participants?
It's a wonderful book by Chandra Manning, M-A-N-N-I-N-G, and it's called what this cruel war was over.
All right, let me get that out. I can type. What this cruel war was over. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, there is a good title to add to your library. Okay, Don, shall we move ahead then?
Now, this next slide, 25, goes back to Garibaldi in a way, but it deals with the huge number of foreign-born soldiers who fought for the Union. It's estimated, and I think it's a low estimate, that about 1 in 4 of all the Union soldiers who served were foreign-born. And I've done an estimate based on some data that was gathered at the end of the war that up to 40% of the Union Army were either immigrants or the sons of immigrants. And there were many that were uncounted, especially coming in through Canada, where they might be British or they might be from other foreign countries, but they would come across the border and fight. Now, the South said that this was a mercenary army, soldiers of fortune, fighting a war that the Yankees themselves would not fight. And so the Union was often embarrassed by the numbers of foreign-born that were fighting. But I want to take a different look at that for a moment and ask, why were they fighting? Because, of course, money was involved, especially as the war went on and the draft was introduced. Union citizens could essentially buy a substitute. But what's interesting about these foreign-born soldiers is that they're not waiting for the draft. They are some of the first to volunteer, and there are huge numbers signing up right at the beginning of the war. And this poster that we're looking at, this, of course, was created right at the time that the rumors of Garibaldi coming over were rife within the United States and abroad, and they named themselves after the great hero of two worlds. This is not actually an Italian regiment, but it's a mixed, very cosmopolitan regiment made up of New Yorkers from every country, and you can see they use the languages of different nations. The Italians, and then Honvedek is a Hungarian term, and then the Friends of Liberty in French, and then the Dutch freedom fighters, meaning the German freedom fighters, patriots of all nations, it says below. And they made up a very colorful regiment. They adopted these Italian uniforms with huge black hats and green plumes, and they marched. They had their own anthem, and they made a very colorful group. Others donned these Zouave uniforms with the baggy, usually red pants, and this was adopted from the North African Berber soldiers that the French imitated, and that became a kind of European or cosmopolitan fashion that you've probably seen pictures of. I think that again, from reading their letters and from looking at the recruitment symbols and appeals, that there was an ideological motive for them, or at least the recruiters were recruiting them. You see on that American flag, right on the staff is the red cap of liberty, which was a symbol that you see again and again in these appeals to foreigners. And everyone knew what that meant. It went back to the French Revolution, and before that, as a symbol, it's the red cap of liberty is a symbol of liberty, of revolution, and particularly of the French Revolution, of red republicans.
Don, we have two questions about the foreign-born soldiers. First, did the foreign-born soldiers think that service in the war would increase their status in the nation, similar to the hopes of African Americans who served in the Union Army? And second, are these European immigrants to some degree more used to war and therefore more prone to get involved, coming from Europe versus American-born people who had not seen war in their lives?
Very good questions, and they're absolutely spot on. Yes, I think this was one of the ways of becoming American, of kind of earning your citizenship. And for a lot of Irish and Germans, especially, the Germans were the most numerous, the Irish second, British third, and then just a whole array of other foreign-born. They were discriminated against. They were often despised, and I think they were there showing that this was their country too, and this was their war. You see this German poster, for example. Look at that line. It says, "Your country is in danger. To arms, to arms," and so they're owning the country. They're owning the war. I would say that at the same time, they were also fighting the cause that they had fought in Germany. Many of them, for example, the German soldiers were 48ers. They had fought in the revolutions of 1848, and they were kind of carrying on this struggle for Republican representative or democratic government, for representative government against aristocracy. And they may not have understood all there was to understand about the South and slavery, but they identified it. They kind of transferred this language of the slaveocracy and monarchy to America, and they fought against these forces of tyranny and slavery. Also, especially for the Germans, but for other foreign immigrants, yes, they had experience. Prussians, for example, had obligatory military service, and many of them came over battle-ready veterans of the wars of 48, and ready to take a role in leadership of these foreign regiments. And so that they were a very important part of the Union victory. I don't think the Union could ever have won without these foreign-born soldiers.
Mm-hmm. So the immigrant soldiers served well. They were effective fighters and leaders.
I believe on balance they did. There was a lot of discrimination and a lot of criticism that, for example, the German soldiers were cowards, that they didn't obey orders, that they retreated, and that they were out there just for the bounties, and that they would collect their bounty and then they would go and sign up again in another county, and there's all kinds of discrimination and prejudice. But most of I think the record on balance was that they fought and very valiantly, and no one believed this more than the Confederates. Robert E. Lee was supposed to have said that those damn Dutch, if it weren't for them, I could win this war against the Yankees. But those Germans, they fight like dogs. They fight like bulldogs.
So two different views of the immigrant soldiers. We have another question here. Was it easier to recruit the immigrants as soldiers because they had no families in this country?
Yes. The immigrant population was younger and more masculine. That is, there were more males of military age in the immigrant population generally. And not only, most of them were here at the time the war broke out. They came in during the 1850s, and there was a huge immigration. All of a sudden, during the war, that immigration just kind of ground to a stop almost. And where they used to get 500,000 immigrants coming in each year, it went down to about 92,000 in 1861, and it stayed there the next year. And then it begins to build again. And that's one of the secrets of the Union victory, is that they encouraged this immigration during the war, and they were recruiting overseas, not officially, but they had recruiting agents over there who were recruiting substitutes overseas in Ireland and in Northern Europe. And that was a very important part of what Lincoln called the replenishing stream that would replenish the army as it was being decimated by death and by disease and desertion.
And we have, let me see here, we have another question here. Did immigrants participate in the draft riots? And of course, we know that a lot of Irish immigrants did. Does that pose a contradiction there between their willingness to fight on the side of the Union and their resistance to the draft?
Yes, it was a contradiction, and the draft riots were led, or at least were fueled by a lot of Irish discontent in particular. The Irish were more divided. They were the largest immigrant group, and they fought, many of them, for both sides. But the Irish were they were Catholic. They were more conservative. They were lower in the socioeconomic hierarchy, and they were more fearful of competition with black labor in New York. And I think that was what ignited the draft riots. Draft resistance was really flamboyant and dramatic in that draft riot of 1863, but draft resistance was common, and probably more native-born were involved in draft resistance in one way or another than foreign-born. I think in the whole scheme of things, foreigners were serving as substitutes for Yankees, for native-born, who were looking for others to substitute for them when the draft was on.
Okay, well, shall we move on then to our next poster?
Well, here's one that I think really appeals to all these foreign symbols. You have that Zouave uniform with the red baggy trousers, not very practical, but very dashing looking. And this European-looking soldier with all of the symbols of cities and flames on the right, and cities and schools on the left, a community, a Republican community that is being defended by this soldier with his foot on the chest of one of the rebels. And here are just a set of posters that you can see appealing to different nationalities, Germans on the left, and then this fascinating poster in the middle of for a regiment that would be of Lancers. Can you imagine, with this kind of dandy-looking Renaissance-style soldier, a man in tights with this ruffled shirt on, and a regiment led by Joseph Smolinski, a Polish hero. His father had been a hero in the Polish uprisings, and now he was trying to raise a regiment. Smolinski, I later found, was recruiting Poles to fight for the Confederacy later in the war. So he was kind of a soldier of fortune. On the far right, the Irish harp and the Corcoran Zouaves, and there at the bottom, a feminine figure of liberty with that familiar liberty cap on the staff that was ubiquitous in these appeals, and then justice, feminine figures of the nation and of justice calling on the men to fight for them.
We have a question here about the Zouaves. Were there Zouaves both the North and in the South?
Yes, that was a popular uniform, totally impractical for wading through creeks in America, but really good looking, at least at the beginning of the war. I think you get a lot of young men to sign up with the idea that they would look as dashing as those images in the posters.
Yeah,
so that was used to good effect by both sides.
Yeah, so the romantic appeal, right? So the romantic appeal was a powerful motivator.
Yes, but it's obvious too that this was a kind of international appeal that made the Civil War, yes, a romantic kind of cosmopolitan event.
Now, you mentioned that Smolinski was trying to raise Polish soldiers for the South. Did the South extend appeals to other foreigners to fight for the Confederacy?
there were efforts overseas to recruit foreign-born. The Poles were susceptible because they had risen up in 1863 against their Russian rulers, and the United States was considered to be friendly to Russia during this time, and the Poles regarded the United States as their enemies. And so I found evidence of the U.S. ambassador in France kind of scratching his head and saying the Confederates are raising regiments of Poles, and they're going to send them over to the Confederacy to fight against the United States.
Okay, well, shall we move on to wrap things up to our last slide?
Well, here is Karl Marx writing in the New York Tribune, and I think one of the things to understand was that overseas, it wasn't just the Union or the Confederacy trying to tell Europeans, here's what your war is about, here's what we're fighting, but also Europeans kind of talking back and interpreting the war. And Karl Marx, who everyone has heard of, was actually earning a living at this time, writing for the New York Daily Tribune and then later for German language presses. And he was absolutely obsessed with the war. And this is an article for the New York Daily Tribune where he's commenting on the London Times, which was commenting on those Orleans princes that I had mentioned earlier. And here he says that the first grand war of contemporaneous history is the American War. The peoples of Europe know that the Southern slaveocracy commenced that war with the declaration that the continuance of slaveocracy was no longer compatible with the continuance of the Union. Consequently, the people of Europe know that a fight for the continuance of the Union is a fight against the continuance of the slaveocracy. That in this contest, the highest form of popular self-government till now realized is giving battle to the meanest and most shameless form of man's enslaving recorded in the annals of history. So Marx is really on the side of the Union here, and of course is calling for the working class of Europe to support this Union war against what he sees the slaveocracy. This despite Lincoln's and Seward's protestations that it's only a war to preserve the Union.
So Marx then really he is speaking for the working class as opposed, of course, to the elites who ruled Europe at the time.
Yes, that broad public opinion that Schurz had anticipated, not just the workers, but also the middle class who had opposed slavery.
Right. We have a question here. Char Weigel writes, so the countries of origin of the immigrants held back from endorsing the North because of the lack of overt acknowledgement of slavery as a focus of the war. But once the immigrants arrive in the United States, the absence of an abolition mission does not prevent the immigrants from joining en masse. So is the issue more diplomacy than individual sentiment? How would you respond to that?
It's an interesting question because I think what you see in Marx's language here, and in the immigrants, and in the way that they view this war, is that this is a war. Whether Lincoln and Seward acknowledge it or not, this is a war against the slaveocracy. This is a war more important to preserve republicanism, to not just save the Union, but to save the democratic idea. And that this is, as Lincoln put it, the last best hope of earth to uphold popular self-government. So these ideas of the Union as the savior of representative government, or the Union as the emancipator, they are two kind of overlapping ideas. And I think that what you have here is foreigners on the ground fighting the war, and an international community abroad who are saying to the Union, whatever you think this is, we think this is a war, a continuation of the war that we have fought in Europe, and it now is an epic battle over the future of democracy and slavery. So it's a kind of melodramatic interpretation of a war that Lincoln and Seward are still kind of, and the Union is saying, no, this is just to preserve the Union. And so they're exaggerating. They're ahead of the Union, and they help shape what the war would become.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, well, we've reached the end of our time. Let me ask if there are any further questions or final comments before we wrap things up. Anything coming across the chat here before we call it in to our seminar? Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to urge you to use the form to continue the discussion. We will monitor the form until January 11th, which means that we'll pass any comments and questions that we get on to Don, and we'll get back in touch with you. I want to thank Don for an excellent seminar, despite the sound problems. And ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for those. I learned a great deal, and I hope our participants did too. Don, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I enjoyed it.
Good. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you. You had a lot of really good questions, really good discussion in the chat tonight, and I thank you for that. That always makes the seminars exciting and entertaining. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please check our spring schedule at americainclass.org to find out what we're offering in the spring. I think you'll find some really good seminars there, and I hope you'll sign up and join us again. Please don't forget your evaluations. As I said, we need those. And thank you very much for your participation this evening. We hope you'll be joining us again in the future. Thank you, and good evening.
Thanks, Richard.